Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to Pathologies of Faith, the intersection of Messianic myth with power. I am your host, Peter Maravelis, and this special programming is brought to you by City Lights in conjunction with the University of California Press and Yale University Press. We will be featuring talks today by Kyle Smith, Yii-Jan Lin, and Jonathan Rauch. Our broadcast is beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. It is always an honor and a privilege to be able to do so. Today's program explores the ways in which the mythic roots of the Old and New Testaments influence contemporary politics and culture. The program will be composed of 4 sessions. The participants joining us today have delved deeply into the connections between current events and various interpretations and misinterpretations of biblical scripture, as well as examining the cultural origins of contemporary Christianity. Kyle Smith will explore how Christianity is built upon the legacies of the apostles and martyrs and how this informs American philosophy and politics to this day. Yii-Jan Lin will raise important questions about who we are as Americans and how scripture shapes our imaginations in surprising and sometimes troubling ways. Jonathan Rauch will discuss what happens to American democracy if Christianity is no longer able or willing to perform the functions on which our constitutional order depends. The sessions will end with a panel discussion bringing all 3 participants together for a review of the day's explorations. We will be taking a short break between each session, and we will resume within 10 to 15 minutes. You may use the same Zoom link for each session. We will close out each room after each session and ask that you re-enter at the appointed time. So our first session is called Cult of the Dead, A Brief History of Christianity. We're going to be joined by Kyle Smith. His session is named after his book of the same name. It's published by University of California Press. We will be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard, with which you may purchase copies of his book. We will also make some time at the end of the session for a Q&A, so please do post your questions and comments in that same chat function. Kyle Smith is professor of historical studies and study of religion at the University of Toronto. An award-winning educator, he is the author or co-author of 4 other books about Christian saints and martyrs. His published works include Constantine and the Captive Christians of Persia, Martyrdom and Religious Identity in the Late Antiquity, and Martyrdom and the History of Blessed Simon Bar Sabah, amongst others. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Professor Smith. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's such an honor to have you with us, and welcome to City Lights.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thank you for all the applause. Thanks to everyone for joining me. I've been studying early Christian saints and martyrs for the past 25 years, and one pattern has emerged with striking clarity. Christianity is a cult of the dead. It was born from the stories about its martyrs, sustained by their memory, and continues to be shaped by them today, albeit in wildly different ways depending on where and how one looks. What I want to do today, necessarily skipping over quite a lot in the interest of time, is try to give some historical background of how this cult of the dead evolved from ancient Rome to modern America. And what I hope this might reveal is why persecution narratives remain so politically powerful. So some definition of terms. I know our minds go straight to the sinister when we hear the word cult, to the Jim Joneses and David Koreshes of the world. But etymologically speaking, cult isn't a pejorative. It's from a Latin verb meaning to care. That's why agriculture means care for the fields. To cultivate a plant or a child's love of music is to care for it, to nurture it. So calling Christianity a cult of the dead isn't a slur, but a statement of fact. Christians cared for their martyrs, for their names, stories, bones, shrines, even the dates on which they were killed. The earliest lists of Christian martyrs that have survived in our ancient manuscripts are arranged by the calendar so that the dates marking the martyrs' deaths could be remembered and celebrated. All of you know at least one of these dates. According to tradition, a 3rd century martyr who performed Christian marriages was beaten with clubs and beheaded on February 14th, St. Valentine. While it's true that all the old gods of Rome weren't swept away in a flash when the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century, it's just as true that Christian political and cultural influence did begin to accelerate rapidly with newfound access to imperial money and power. Funny how that works. But here's what's interesting. Far from ending Christian concern for the martyrs, Constantine's conversion and subsequent support for the faith marked the moment when the Christian cult of the dead could now become more public and more visibly enshrined. Within just 2 or 3 generations of Constantine, Christian art, architecture, and public worship centered on commemorating the holy dead was flourishing throughout the Roman Empire, from Britain to Persia. This cultivation of martyrs' memories soon solidified into the bedrock of Christian culture. It's no wonder that cult and culture share the same root, both reflecting what a society chooses to nurture. As the anthropologist Clifford Geertz famously put it, culture is most simply defined as the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. What we tell ourselves we value most highly, that is our culture. And what is Christianity's most valued story, if not a tale of a death transformed? Before going any further in my explanation of how Christianity evolved from Jesus to the apostles and martyrs into a true cult of the dead, let me offer a contemporary perspective on cultural memory through the opening lines of Metamorphosis, a short story by the writer and neuroscientist David Eagleman. There are 3 deaths, Eagleman begins. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment, sometime in the future, when your name is spoken for the last time. Eagleman's prose is as economical as it is profound. He can say in a paragraph what others can't in a novel. And he excels at crafting speculative scenarios that begin with a haunting idea and then veer off into odd conceptual spaces that attempt to envision scores of conceivable afterlives. In the story of this afterlife, those waiting for their name to be spoken for the last time are forced to linger in a vast waiting room. Some wait for centuries, like those whose names are written on monuments or inscribed in the history books. Others, who were never famous in life, have become trapped there by quirks of fate. Eagleman gives the example of a farmer who drowned a long time ago. Because what was once his farm is now a college campus, the tour guides always mention the farmer as part of their spiel. And the more his story is told, Eagleman says, the more the details drift. The farmer is utterly alienated from his name. It is no longer identical with him, but it continues to bind. And that, Eagleman concludes, is the curse of this room. Since we live in the heads of those who remember us, we lose control of our lives and become who they want us to be. I've been keenly aware of the curse of that room while working on my current book project, The Many Lives of Saint Nick. It tells the story of how an ancient bishop, the patron saint of sailors and thieves, and how he became the global icon of Christmas. Initially, I thought of The Many Lives of Saint Nick as a sort of biography, but I soon realized that the book isn't about Nicholas. It's about us. We are the ones who keep invoking his name and telling his tales. The medieval Nicholas was not the jolly gift giver we know. This Nicholas's most famous miracles include saving 3 girls from being sold into prostitution by their own father and resurrecting 3 boys who'd been murdered, butchered, and packed with salt into a barrel so that they could later be served as meat to guests at an inn. Find me one parent today who would tell such tales to their children on a cold Christmas Eve as visions of dismemberment dance in their heads. Saint Nick has changed. He has become who we want him to be. What I want to suggest is that this concept of metamorphosis through storytelling applies not just to saints, but to the entire Christian tradition. So much so that Christianity is misunderstood if taken as a singular noun. What we call Christianity in Constantine's Rome is dramatically different from its later manifestations in colonial America or modern Nigeria. Like all religious traditions, Christianity is shaped by and shapes the societies that it inhabits. It's not a timeless entity, only occasionally affected by culture, but a thoroughly cultural phenomenon from the start. Even the earliest Christian communities were diverse, interpreting what they understood as Jesus' message through their own immediate concerns. Christian traditions function as ongoing conversations among texts, practices, and communities across time, evolving because they are human enterprises responding to changing circumstances. Their power comes not from some transcendent essence, but from their remarkable ability to transform while maintaining narrative continuity with their past. An authentic Christianity, untouched by culture, is thus an illusion. There is no pure, original faith outside of historical and cultural contexts. Christianity is constantly evolving with each new generation and geography. This, to my mind, in no way diminishes Christianity's significance. Instead, it locates its meaning where it actually operates, in the lived experiences of communities navigating their worlds through inherited, yet continuously reinterpreted cultural frameworks. And yet here we are on Easter weekend discussing pathologies of faith. The medical connotation is unmistakable. A pathologist analyzes tissues and fluids in order to diagnose the living or to determine what killed the dead. Such a metaphor for Christianity clearly implies that some expressions of faith are healthy while others are diseased. Admittedly, it is tempting to diagnose the Christian nationalism currently infecting our politics as pathological, as a movement less interested in piety than in seizing control of government, media, educational institutions, even private businesses. But this diagnosis assumes that alongside it exists some normative, true Christianity that can be objectively identified. This idealized version is often portrayed as a gentle ethics of love thy neighbor, the Christianity of Martin Luther King, not Marjorie Taylor Greene. But such tidy distinctions strip Christianity of its apocalyptic origins and complex evolution. Religious traditions don't work this way. What exists is hundreds of Christianities that each one of us might variously categorize as good, bad, or indifferent. Yet they all draw from the same well of texts, traditions, and symbols. Their distinctions lie in how they interpret their shared inheritance through opposing political frameworks for distinct cultural ends. So how can I characterize Christianity as a cult of the dead without falling into the same pathological trap? My answer lies in understanding how Christianity's origins in martyrdom forged a dynamic framework of remembrance, one that evolves while preserving its fundamental narrative, a tradition that finds meaning in death and creates power through how it remembers the dead. This isn't a pathology. It is the basis of Christian identity. Think about it like this. Without Jesus' death and resurrection, Christianity would be merely another ancient philosophical school. The Apostle Paul makes this unambiguous to the people of Corinth. If the resurrection didn't happen, he says, then faith is in vain, and the dead are dead. Jesus' miracles aren't the basis of Christianity, nor were his teachings meant as timeless moral guidelines. They were urgent instructions for the imminent coming of God. As the Episcopal priest Andrew Thayer put it last week in a Palm Sunday op-ed for the New York Times, Jesus wasn't killed for preaching love or healing the sick. Rome didn't crucify philosophers or miracle workers. Rome crucified insurrectionists. This apocalyptic framework made Jesus' execution a political stance against imperial power. When Paul wrote to Christians in Rome, he told them that they too had died and been buried with their Lord in baptism. This ritual death and rebirth was physically embodied in many ancient baptistries, some of which were shaped as rectangular pools with 3 steps, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, down into a watery grave. The initiate was fully immersed, putting to death the deeds of the body, as Paul described it, the stain of sin dissolving in the waters of baptism. After this symbolic drowning, the newly baptized Christian would climb 3 steps out the far side of the pool and be wrapped in a white robe that functioned both as a burial shroud and a pristine garment of resurrection. The most venerated Christians were baptized in more than just water. The martyrs received a second baptism in their own blood. If baptism was one symbolic initiation, so was the cross, not merely a reminder of a single event in the past, but a model for imitation again and again. Now, the notion that Jesus's brutal execution served as a model for Christians to follow might strike many today as absurd. But for early Christians, imitating Christ meant embracing, at least in principle, his suffering and death. This history is sanitized when holiness is reduced to simple piety, to garden statue varieties of St. Francis with a bird on his shoulder. Any clear-headed study of the ancient stories about the apostles and martyrs must inevitably lead to the inescapable but repugnant conclusion, as my colleague Candida Moss once put it, that dying for Christ may be a central rather than peripheral part of the Christian experience. How central? A striking answer comes from Ignatius of Antioch, whose 2nd century letters are among Christianity's first non-biblical texts. As Ignatius was being hauled to Rome to be executed, he wrote to his friends there and begged them to help by not intervening. "Let me be the food of wild beasts," he pleaded, "through whom it is possible to attain God." Describing himself as God's wheat, Ignatius envisions his body ground in martyrdom's mill and baked into Christ's pure bread. For him, willingly dying for Christ is simply what it meant to be, as he called it, a true disciple. Ignatius was not an outlier. Scores of other stories reinforce this idea. According to the New Testament's Acts of the Apostles, James, the son of Zebedee, was beheaded by Herod Agrippa, while Stephen was stoned by a mob. Traditions outside the Bible continued this trend. Matthew was allegedly stabbed in Ethiopia for questioning the king's morality. Thomas was speared in India after convincing many married women there to embrace both Christianity and sexual abstinence. An innovation it seems their husbands opposed. Apart from John, reportedly the only apostle to die peacefully, all of Jesus's inner circle met violent ends. At least so our ancient sources tell us. Peter and Andrew were crucified, Simon the Zealot was crucified or sawn in half, Philip was hung up by his ankles on iron hooks like a slaughtered pig. Bartholomew endured perhaps the most horrific death. Some accounts say he was crucified or beheaded, others that he was flayed alive. Still others say all 3. Whether any of these contradictory accounts is historically true or not hardly matters. What's important is that these stories persisted and multiplied. These were the stories that Christians told themselves about themselves. Hundreds of martyrdom narratives were copied into thousands of manuscripts across dozens of languages: Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Armenian, Georgian, Old Slavonic, Christian Arabic, and on and on. These stories' cultural power was so enduring that when Michelangelo painted the Last Judgment fresco on the Sistine Chapel's altar wall 15 centuries after Bartholomew's death, he depicted the apostle showing off how he had been killed, with a flensing knife in one hand and the empty bag of his own skin in the other. No name was needed on the painting. Everyone already knew who it was. Bartholomew's story, like those of so many other martyrs, transformed suffering into sanctity. In this case, elevating a gruesome death into high art that still adorns one of the most hallowed spaces in Christendom. This is death reimagined, not an ending, but a profound act of spiritual becoming. As martyrdom stories were transmitted across the centuries, they were strategically adapted for new theological and political purposes. By the mid-16th century, when Michelangelo was still painting in Rome, these narratives were being dramatically reinterpreted across the English Channel. In a bustling print shop in London, John Foxe was crafting what would become his era's most influential account of Christian suffering. Foxe was a passionate Protestant scholar, fluent in the languages and literatures of early Christianity, and he produced a massive book of church history that he called the Acts and Monuments. It quickly became more popularly known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs. Foxe's work responded to an urgent crisis. In the mid-1550s, during the reign of the Catholic Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, English Protestants were being burned at the stake. Foxe brilliantly reframed these executions by positioning Protestant martyrs as the true spiritual heirs of the early apostles and martyrs who had died under Roman persecution. While Catholics claimed legitimacy through the succession of popes and bishops, Foxe constructed an alternative lineage based on suffering. In his telling, martyrs weren't saints to be venerated, but living testimonies to Protestant authenticity. Each burning was a raised fist against papal authority. The political implications were profound. When Mary's sister, the Protestant Queen Elizabeth, came to power, she quickly grasped how useful Foxe's book could be, and she ordered every church in England to keep a copy of it next to the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer. Combined, these three texts, martyrs, scriptures, prayers, made one thing clear: to be English was not to be Catholic. Deluxe volumes of Foxe's book were secured on chains in formerly Catholic cathedrals, now administered by the Church of England. More modest editions became treasured family heirlooms whose ownership we can still find recorded in rural wills. Captains in the Royal Navy read selections of the Book of Martyrs aloud to their sailors, using the stories to urge the lads on against their Catholic adversary, the Spanish Armada. This pattern of adapting earlier notions of martyrdom to serve new theological and political ends has continued, taking new forms with each generation. Let me fast forward to conclude with two strikingly different modern examples. First, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a German Lutheran pastor who countered Nazi ideology with his concept of costly grace, the imperative to risk everything when confronted with evil. Unlike cheap grace, which demands no personal sacrifice, Bonhoeffer's costly grace requires embodied action. And Bonhoeffer didn't just theorize about martyrdom, he lived it, joining the resistance and ultimately being arrested for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Hitler. Almost exactly 80 years ago today, in April of 1945, just weeks before the war's end, Bonhoeffer was hanged, thus becoming the costly grace he had written about. His book, The Cost of Discipleship, remains influential in Christian ethical circles and established Bonhoeffer as a modern Christian example of sacrificial witness against tyranny. On the other hand, there are evangelical organizations like Voice of the Martyrs, whose website is persecution.com. That's not a joke. Their URL is literally persecution.com. Other such groups, including International Christian Concern, you can find them at persecution.org, Open Doors USA, and World Watch List, they all publicize what they describe as the persecution of Christians throughout the world, more often than not in predominantly Muslim nations. Of course, it's important to note that not all claims of persecution are exaggerated or politically motivated. In some parts of the world, Christians have been and still are imprisoned, attacked, and killed for their faith, real suffering that deserves serious attention. But these genuine cases are all too often co-opted by broader narratives that serve very different agendas. The emphasis and framing of persecution among many of these evangelical organizations is not simply journalistic description. It's theology and it's politics. Their persecution narratives draw on biblical authority, particularly passages declaring that all who desire to live a godly life in Jesus will be persecuted. This victimization language has become deeply embedded in American political discourse in ways that are both humorous and much more concerning. We see it, for instance, in the annual outrage over the holiday cups at Starbucks, or more dramatically, last Easter, when Donald Trump directly compared his own legal troubles to Jesus's trials. Though Trump once famously couldn't cite a single Bible verse, he instinctively understands how to perform Christian persecution for political effect, something evangelicals, particularly those attuned to ministries like Voice of the Martyrs, are primed to recognize and respond to. These narratives serve multiple functions. They forge identity by linking today's believers with apostles and martyrs through shared suffering, even when such historical connections remain completely unspoken. They provide divine justification for urgent global evangelization, and they seamlessly align with conservative geopolitical interests. Voice of the Martyrs highlighted communist persecution of Christians during the Cold War. Today, it focuses on secular globalism and Islam, which are often framed as hostile ideologies or intolerant regimes. In this worldview, international institutions like the UN, NATO, and sometimes even humanitarian agencies like USAID are not forces for cooperation, but threats to Christian sovereignty. And yet here we are, on Easter weekend, talking about martyrdom, memory, and messianic power in a gravely wounded republic. If I were a theologian, which I most assuredly am not, I would like to hope that one day we might look back on the death of American democracy through which we are living, and, like the paradoxical Friday of Jesus's crucifixion, somehow declare it good. But history, like Scripture, teaches us that genuine resurrections come at a terrible cost. Thank you for your time.
Well, thank you so much for that, Professor Smith. We would like to open it up now for questions and comments. You may do so from the chat function of your Zoom dashboard. If you go down to the bottom, please post them in the chat and I will call them from there. So I'm just curious, also coming up on this next book and Saint Nick, you mentioned, of course, that Saint Nick was also a thief and a person of the sea. This is a very interesting kind of a transition from this book to that. And could you talk a little bit about that transition in your work?
Sure. Yeah. Well, just to clarify, he was the patron saint of sailors and also thieves. There's no story about him being a thief himself. Well, the transition is, so a lot of what this previous book, Cult of the Dead, focused on was all of the elements all of the cultural elements that developed over the centuries around the martyrs. I mentioned this very briefly, their names, their stories, the calendars that are recording when they lived, when they died, their shrines, but also their bones. And one small passage, one couple of pages in Cult of the Dead, within a broader chapter about the cult of the relics, the cult of saints and martyrs' bones in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, but still continuing in ways to this day, talked about Saint Nicholas and the competition for his bones. So he didn't die as a martyr, nor did he die as a monk, nor was he a theologian. And yet there are various traditions that try to make him into all of the above. And he was buried in the city of what was called Myra, Myra, in what's now Turkey, southern Turkey on the Aegean coast, and in the fourth century. But in the 11th century, in 1087, some sailors from Bari on the southern coast of Italy said, we need a saint who's going to generate some pilgrim dollars. We need an economic driver for our city. And at the time, Myra was under attack and control of Muslims. And so they said, well, you know, he's not really being all that useful sitting over there in that old abandoned church anyway. So they went over, they broke open his tomb, they stole his bones, and they brought them back to Bari. And I was there last May in Bari for the 937th annual celebration of a tomb robbery. So it's both that sort of context that ties back into the book, but also it has to do with the fact that the chair of my department wanted me a long time ago to not teach just courses on early and medieval Christianity, but more comparative ones or more thematic ones on the history of Christianity. And he said, well, how about a course on Christian holidays? I said, well, that would be huge. I said, I could do just one. What about Christmas? He said, there you go. So I started teaching an undergrad course on Christmas, which quickly became my very favorite course to teach. I've taught it at least half a dozen times now, and that's the obvious tie-in there of the two. But both Cult of the Dead and the Many Lives of Saint Nick do what I like to do in my undergraduate courses, which is start in antiquity and then sort of trace a theme all the way to the 21st century. So this book will start on Christmas Eve in New York at the home of Clement Clarke Moore, and then we go back and then we sort of slowly move forward. But it will be much less, you know, Norman Rockwell and much more bones coming from Bari.
Yeah. Just absolutely fascinating narrative. I really look forward to that book. So the questions have begun coming through. Marita comments, thank you. This was very interesting. I am a scholar of medieval sanctity, and in the medieval tradition, there is a discourse and differentiation between imitation and admiration. The dedication to virginity or martyrdom is more to be admired than imitated, a kind of, quote, don't do this at home, unquote, warning. Does this didactic distinction continue after the early modern era?
Um, yeah, I think that I think that that distinction sort of persisted beginning in late antiquity, right? As Paula Fredrickson once put it, you know, we've got this idea that Christians everywhere up until the time of Constantine are hiding out in caves and there's always threats and they're all being persecuted and killed. And Fredrickson put it this way. She said, it's not as if there were tens upon tens of thousands of people being killed prior to Constantine, but what you have is tens upon tens of thousands of people reading the stories and admiring the very few who actually were. So you can have this discourse, this notion of this, as Ignatius says, right? This is what it means to be a true disciple, but it doesn't mean that everyone certainly is acting upon it. Not everyone is going to a monastery. Not everyone is becoming a virgin. Not everyone is becoming a martyr. So I wouldn't necessarily even set that distinction as happening in the early modern period. I think it happens, you know, quite early on, where you can hold these people up and celebrate that and remember it in various ways while not having to do it yourself.
Yeah. Let's see if there's anything else. Anyone else? Well, that may be it. I'll give him just a moment. Yeah, I guess that is about it. Professor Smith, we are honored to have had you grace our halls. I mean, really grateful to you, and I look forward to hearing more from you during the panel discussion. I also want to thank Catrice Campbell of University of California Press for her help with today's programming. I also want to thank all of you in the audience for joining us today. We're going to be taking a short break now. Our next session will be at 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. It's called Immigration and Apocalypse, How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration. We're going to be joined by Yii-Jan Lin. You may also use the same Zoom link to access that section as you have for this one, so we hope to see you there. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and our educational outreach. These are all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. We will be closing this room down in just a moment, so hope to see you shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.